This is our rhetoric and writing lecture for week 9, March 14th to March 18th for English 101. This one's a little bit longer. The others have been, I had just a 3-minute or so video for our readings. This will take a little bit longer, but still, I think, try to keep this one to 15 minutes or less. And again, thanks for watching these if you are. This is the main way I'm delivering the content other than through the readings that you're doing. And this is hopefully helping you make some sense of some of the readings and giving you some order to the course if you're watching these. So argument, persuasion, propaganda, you might remember during week 5, and if you want to go back and review this video, week 5, our rhetoric and writing video for week 5 talked about persuasion and then also argument. These are two things that are interrelated, but they also have some real clear differences. And of course, what they're important in our class is because when you're writing, you're often trying to persuade, even in academic writing. Now, of course, if you look at advertising or any kind of promotional writing, they're clearly trying to persuade people. And in academic writing, we do something a little bit more nuanced, which we often call argument. Which, argument kind of can sound like two people just openly disagreeing, but in academics, it's a little bit different than that. Although it shares a lot of things with an actual, like a verbal or an email or a text argument, which we can have. But let's talk about the 3 things: argument, persuasion, and propaganda, which again are our topics for today. And start just to, the most important thing I think for today is just to think, can I recognize this when somebody's either trying to persuade me or is maybe, doing a little bit of an argument in their writing, or is actually using propaganda. And again, the newest thing here is propaganda. Argument and persuasion go back, as far as we know, at least to ancient Greece. So they're a couple thousand years old and beyond, whereas propaganda is kind of a 20th century. A lot of people would say, anyway, it's a 20th century invention. Some people trace the history of propaganda back to World War I, and we're going to look at a couple of examples, so around 1914 or 1915. And in that day, it was used in advertising, of course, but also really developed for the war effort in World War I. So let's look at the kind of some things that are what we would call the rhetorical goals. Remember, rhetoric is using language effectively. That's the way we define it for the class. And so your rhetorical goals are the things you want to use language in a certain way to make something happen. And for argument, this is the highest maybe level of what we call altruism. You're not thinking about yourself as much as you're thinking about others. Maybe some people would say argument is a little more altruistic, because you're really searching to discover the truth. What is the truth? And you're looking as openly as you can at both sides of the issue. At least in the beginning of an argument paper, you can look at multiple viewpoints, and then maybe you in the end maybe you narrow it down. But in the beginning, you're just trying to discover the truth. Persuasion, on the other hand, you're trying to promote an opinion. You've already made up your mind. Whereas in an argument, part of that paper might be helping you actually understand the issue more thoroughly and make up your mind. This is the way I see it. These are all kind of debatable things, really. But there's different ways to look at this. But the way I look at it is persuasion is you've already made up your mind, and you're just going to try to prove that. But your argument is still, or your persuasion rather, is still rooted in the truth. So you still think it's important what is true and what's not true. Whereas propaganda goes a little beyond that. So over here, we're really trying to learn the truth and then just express it. Here, we're interested in the truth, but we already have our mind made up and we just want to prove that to somebody. And then finally, propaganda. It offers, notice quotation marks, political advertising. In other words, advertising, not necessarily maybe in the traditional sense that we think, politics or advertising, but something that's just arguing for a particular position. And this is the important difference here. It may distort the truth or even include false information. So propaganda, persuasion, we want to prove our point. We already made up our mind. Propaganda, we don't even care if we're being truthful completely. And there's different levels of breaking that truth. We talked about logical fallacies a few weeks back, and logical fallacies would usually be an important part of it. Someone's way of persuading you using propaganda. So what are the techniques like if you're using one of these? And again, let me just be very clear. I'm hoping that you won't use propaganda in your papers. It's more about recognizing it. Persuasion is fine. You've made, and argument. So these are both good strategies to use in the papers you're writing for our class or for any class in college. Propaganda is not a good strategy. In fact, depending on the instructor, they're going to really grade that down because you're being less than truthful here, and that's really important as you the best you to the best of your knowledge. So argument offers good reasoning and evidence to persuade an audience to accept truth, but you're also sort of learning as you go sometimes with the argument. Persuasion offers personal, emotional. So remember we talked about ethos, pathos, logos. You might really tap into those when you're trying to persuade somebody. Those are the basic appeals, using emotion, using the fact that you can trust me, you can rely on me so I can persuade you, or maybe just using good reasons or logic to convince an audience to accept a particular point of view. But again, you have your mind made up at the very beginning. You don't beat around the bush. You don't look at really opposing views so much, usually in a strictly persuasive essay, whereas in an argument, you would look at the other side and give that some hearing. Propaganda relies on emotions and values to persuade an audience to accept a particular position. And so manipulation, is a word that comes up a lot when we talk about propaganda, but it's really focused on emotions and values. And there's nothing wrong with values. We usually think of the word value as being a really good thing, right? But when you're using maybe somebody values something that's not necessarily moral, but you're using that kind of as a way to persuade, that can be maybe potentially a bad thing. So again, but this emotional idea, maybe fear, anger, frustration, all these are emotions that can be tied into what people value, and then persuading an audience to accept a particular position. But again, remember with propaganda, often not being truthful too. So we have the combination of using somebody's emotions, but then also maybe not telling them the whole truth. A little bit more about methods for argument. You consider other perspectives. So that's one of the most important things about an argument that's different than persuasion or propaganda. You really have to do that. So when I ask you to write an argument paper, it's really important. Like our essay 5 and 6, I'm asking you to really write an argument, not just a purely persuasive paper. So it's important to include that other perspective from other people. So maybe if you're arguing that healthcare is too expensive to provide for everybody, prenatal care, then you'd want to at least talk a little bit about the other side, the people who are arguing that prenatal care should be, no matter how expensive it is, it should be something that we do for all of our residents and citizens in our country. So that would be looking at another perspective. You're looking at the opposite side as to what you believe and what you're arguing for. Provides evidence, of course, we want to do that. Predicts and evaluates the consequences of accepting the argument. That's a really important part of an argument. Persuasion may consider other notice it says may, so it doesn't say it has to, whereas with argument, it says it does. You have to do that for argument. But for persuasion, it's kind of more optional. Blends facts and emotion, so we would use a lot more emotion probably in a persuasive essay, strictly persuasive, than in an argumentative essay. And remember, for essay 5 and 6, I'm asking you to write a more argumentative essay, so moving away from emotion or personal stories as much, and moving more toward evidence and different predictions that you make, and so on. May predict the consequences if it's helpful, but it doesn't necessarily have to, but arguments tend to do that. And then propaganda focuses on its own message without definitely does not consider other perspectives. So like you see a Coca-Cola commercial, they're not saying, Pepsi's really pretty good. I mean, it's good in a lot of ways. The taste is good, and they don't look at the good side of Pepsi. They're just selling you Coca-Cola. That's just an example. I'm not saying all advertising is propaganda, but it kind of is for the most part, because it's not really interested in the other side of the coin as argument is. Relies on biases and assumptions. So bias is not a good thing, right? We talked about our sources when we were doing research earlier in the semester. Sources have to try to be unbiased as much as you can, right? That's why we look for sources that are peer reviewed, where there's no such thing as a really unbiased source, but we try to get rid of as much bias as we can. But some propaganda doesn't even try. They don't care. They want it to be biased, probably. It may distort or alter evidence and ignore the consequences, right? Don't worry about what's going to happen. Just listen to me and do this thing. So again, argument, persuasion, propaganda is kind of a continuum, going from kind of, like I said, almost like the altruistic to, I don't want to say evil, but it's, propaganda can get to that pretty fast. And persuasion is usually kind of in the middle, walking that line between, being focused on your own wants and desires without propaganda crosses that line of them being able to say or do anything to basically get what you want. So it becomes like manipulation. Again, can become very, the opposite of altruistic, I guess, would be very selfish. in a lot of ways. Let's look at a couple of examples and then we'll wrap up. Like I said, I want to try to keep this pretty brief this week, let you get started with your spring break. This is, I believe, from World War One. And remember I said earlier, World War One was a time in the early 20th century where propaganda was just being developed as a way to kind of, you know, persuade soldiers to enlist and to, you know, and so this is an image here that's obviously doesn't look like a very friendly figure, right? And there's a kind of a German style helmet. So this was probably either English, maybe the French, but I don't think so. It's in English. So it was either Americans or English, probably thinking about the Germans and the kind of threat that they represent. This is culture here, and he's got this stick. Looks like he's bludgeoned some people with it, and then he's kind of carrying off this woman. So, you know, destroy this mad brute. And this is like a symbol. This stands in for Germany, I think is what that is. And then it says enlist. So again, not really thinking, you know, the Germans, they have some good points. You know, it's not really going there, right? And it's not giving an equal hearing. That would be an argument. You probably aren't going to enlist a lot of soldiers with an argument of, well, you know, the Germans had some good points. We did kind of give them a raw deal with this treaty, you know, whatever it was, right? They don't want to say that. They're just destroy the mad brute. And this is so, you can see this is probably an example of propaganda, right? You can guess that. And as we go through this, if you want to just make this more like a bit of a puzzle, freeze the frame and try to just decide, you know, do you think this is more like propaganda, more like persuasion, or more like, you know, the more altruistic argument? I don't know that argument's always altruistic. It might be the wrong word, but I think it tends to be more moral because it's interested in truth. Whereas propaganda here is just interested in, even if this is a great cause, and I'm not saying it wasn't, obviously, to entice people to enlist and fight in World War One. I'm not saying it wasn't a good cause. I'm not saying it was or it wasn't. But even if it is a good cause, it can still be considered propaganda. So it's not so much, we're not talking about whether it's a good cause or it's a bad cause, or you know, Coca-Cola is good or bad. It's just the language that's used. Is it argument? Is it persuasion? Is it propaganda? We're just thinking about the rhetoric here, not so much, not too much whether it's moral or not. Although, like I did say, I think argument's more moral because it's more interested in the truth. Let's go on and look at one or two more. See if you can kind of guess what this next one is. Try to get my face out of the way there, sorry. And so this is all about cars, right? We have features of cars. We have the Civic LX sedan and the Corolla LE. And there's a little asterisk here. It says most fun to drive. And I think that asterisk, if we had the whole thing, it ties into an article in a magazine or something about this car. What you might notice here is everything about the Civic, 5-star rating, has a 40-second lap time, so it's better than the Corolla. So you know, you might say, well, this is just fairly, you know, it's just argument because they're showing you the good and bad of both sides. So if you wanted to stop and think about this and read through it just a minute, you could, and just decide, do you think this is an example of an argument? They're making this argument about the Civic versus the Corolla. They're looking fairly at on both sides, excuse me. Is it a persuasive piece where they're trying to say, oh no, you want to buy the Civic? Or is it propaganda? They're sort of deceiving us here. So if you did take a minute and pause, let's talk about I'll just say a few things. I think it's more of a persuasion. It's not really argument, because I think they chose all the things that are good about the Civic, because it's not just a coincidence, I think, that everything they wrote about best front visibility. I mean, come on, I get it. It's good to be able to see out of your car, but is that really the most important thing to put on this list? I mean, the 5-star rating, you know, it doesn't say 0 to 60. I don't see, that's usually one that we have. So again, I think they cherry picked is what we would call it, right? They just chose the things that are good about the Civic. And that's why I don't think it's propaganda. They're not lying, I don't think, right? We'd have to check that. That would be pretty bad if Honda was doing that. But no, they're just comparing the Honda to the Toyota, and they're cherry picking. So they're choosing just the things they want to focus on. So I think it's an example of persuasion. It's not evil or, you know, propaganda or anything, but it is, you know, they've chosen really carefully what they want to compare. All right, let's look at one more. So this one, he volunteered for submarine service, and look at the attention he's getting now since he volunteered for submarine service. So this is again a recruiting poster. They're always great. I found a bunch of these online. You could probably Google old recruiting posters, but it's an important thing. There's nothing wrong with it. But would you say it's an example of argument, just giving a fair side to each? Is it are they somehow making just a persuasive, you should probably serve, or is there maybe any kind of deception or playing on the emotions or anything like that going on? So if you want to pause it, and I'll come back, and I'll say, okay, if you did pause it, if you didn't, either way is fine. If you're still watching, I would say it's propaganda, because even though the cause is probably good, it's almost basically saying if you volunteer for submarine service, you're suddenly going to have a girlfriend or somebody clinging to you, which could happen. It's not untrue necessarily, but it might be bending, it might be playing with emotions and things like that. So it's probably a really strong persuasion or an example of propaganda. I don't feel like there's any really clear line where that, but I think we can kind of get a sense of it here. All right, let's look at another one real quickly. So here we have, this is from an article about choosing a car. We were talking about a car earlier, right? Like a Corolla or a Honda Civic, I think. There's a much better way to pick the right car at a practical approach that allows room for some fun. Here's an overview of the process. Figure out what you need. Set your budget. Use a car finder tool to match your needs and budget to the market. Test drive at least 3 cars. Review your research and make a decision. So again, if you want to pause this, and is this an argument? Is it persuasion? Is it propaganda? Okay, so if you did that or if you didn't, I would say this is a good argument. That's the way I think of it, because they're just giving you tools to figure it out for yourself, right? They're not telling you which car to buy. They're saying if you try these things, it might actually help you make a better decision. So this one I see is kind of an example of using argument as a way of looking at something. Okay. Here's one more. I love this one. It cut off a little bit, but it says Winston was the brand. Maybe I did that intentionally so I don't get sued by Winston cigarette company. No, it's down here too, right? And it says Winston tastes good, like a cigarette should. That was their old slogan. They would go like that. I always liked those commercials. But Winston tastes good. Even the Fred and Barney. If you know Fred and Barney Flintstone, they did some advertising for Winston, and they're off like smoking behind the house, and Wilma and Betty are getting all upset if you know the Flintstones. But tastes good like a cigarette should. So it's focusing on the taste. And again, if you want to pause this and think, and then there's also just the image, right? You're at the beach, you get the fishing pole, the lantern, the man, the woman, they're attractive, smoking cigarettes out in the natural beauty of the ocean behind. You can kind of see that a little bit. So what do you think? Persuasion, propaganda, argument? Well, take a second. And it's definitely not argument, because there's nothing fair and balanced about this, right? And is it persuasion or propaganda? Well, it's definitely, again, not argument. What do you think? So think about it. But I would say this is geared more toward propaganda, right? We're playing on the emotions. We're not saying, if you smoke Winston, you're going to be healthy, or it's going to help you. It's not really, this cigarette doesn't cause cancer. I mean, they're not going into any sort of, it's just tastes good. It tastes good, and you're going to have a great time. So whether it's propaganda or just very strong persuasion, but I think it's more toward propaganda. All right, let's look at this one. One more here. I think we have 1 or 2 more, and I will be finished. Underrated benefits of exercise. Exercise this is probably like a public service announcement type thing, can reduce stress and anxiety, improve functional mobility, increase energy levels, improved overall health, better sleep, higher self-esteem. These are all benefits, underrated benefits, they say, of exercise. So think about that for just a minute. Is this argument, persuasion, or propaganda? And you might have said argument, and a lot of students do when I've shown this in the past, but I would say it's persuasion. It's not propaganda, I don't think, because I think they're not bending the truth. They're not playing too much with your emotions or anything. They're just expressing a truth, but they have argument would kind of look at, I know some people don't think exercise is such a great thing, and you'd have to look at both sides of it, but this is purely persuasion. I think they believe exercise is good, and they're trying to persuade you to do that. All right, this is kind of a funny one. If you can read this, it only takes concentrate a second on 2 things, a collision out. So it's like you're trying to read this, and they're trying to make the point. Probably don't. If you look at your phone while you're driving, you're more likely to have an accident. So do you think this is an example of argument, persuasion, or propaganda? And I'll give you a second. This one I'm not really actually sure. I included this because I thought it was interesting. And again, I find it kind of fun just to think about um, how somebody's trying to persuade me, right? Because this is probably something like the IDOT, like the Illinois Department of Transportation or something, or maybe Secretary of State's office, where you get your driver's license. Maybe they posted this somewhere. I can't remember where I found it now. Um, I don't think it's really argument because I don't think they're saying, yeah, it might be okay to text and drive at the same time. That might be a good thing. They're not doing that. So I don't know that it's really argument. So the question is it persuasion or is it propaganda? So again, you can think about this. Is it playing on our emotions? It seems to be playing on our emotions a little bit because it's got this clever little thing where, is it a bad cause? I would say no. I would say it's a good cause, in my opinion. That we should be safe when we're in the car. It can be deadly, as a teacher, I'm probably not going to tell you that it's a good thing. But anyway, is it propaganda or is it persuasion? It's definitely not argument. I would think because you're not looking at both sides. It may be playing on our emotions a little bit. Is it looking for the truth? I think that was the kind of the big question for me, and I think it is. I think it's trying to be helpful and look for the truth, and I think it's not going to be lying to us. And I think again, propaganda is comfortable telling us something that's not true. So this may be using a kind of emotional approach, but I would say this is an example of persuasion, from my opinion. And just a reminder, we talked about these 5 methods of persuasion a few weeks back, I think week 5. So if you these are things that you should be trying to use in your essay if you're not already doing that. Doesn't mean you're going to use all 5 of these in every essay, but if you can look at facts, examples, referring to an authority, predicting the consequences. Remember, predicting the consequences is a big thing for both argument and persuasive writing. And all the writing that you're doing for the next couple of essays, you probably want to think about, can you include that, predicting the consequences. What will happen if people accept my point of view? What will happen if people didn't accept my point of view? And then answering the opposition, where you try to think of your possible critics and come up with an answer that you include in your paper. So I didn't keep this terribly brief, but I tried to keep it as short as I could. But just a reminder again, if you didn't watch the other videos, this is week 9, but next week will be spring breaks. Doesn't really count, so we'll be back on week 10, but that'll be not until the 28th, I think. Is that right? Yeah, because the 21st to the 25th, I think, is our spring break. But I put more about that in the overview lecture too. So we'll try to finish everything up this week with our readings. And if you can, get started on essay 5, but it won't be due until April 1st. And if you have any questions, as always, send me an email or stop by my office hours. Again, remember, I'm on campus every day from 12 to 1 office hours, Monday through Thursday. And then I also have online office hours from 1 to 2 on Monday and Tuesday. So I hope you have a great spring break and hope to hear from you soon.